Welcome to the On the Pen, the Weekly Dose podcast, your one-stop shop for obesity medicine news with your host, man on the pen, Dave Knapp. Welcome to On the Pen, the Weekly Dose podcast. I'm your host, Dave Knapp, man on the Manjaro. That's why I'm here. You are on the pen. Wegovy, Saxenda, Victoza, Trulicity, Manjaro, Zepbound, Compound. That pen is what we talk about. We talk about obesity medicine news from the patient perspective. We are bringing you a new genre of news. That's what we're doing it On the Pen. That's what we've been doing now for a couple of years, and we are growing. Really excited for some of the stuff that is happening in the On the Pen world right now. And we're going to get into some of it. But before we do, no matter what platform you're watching on, engagement is what helps us grow. It's the easiest way to advocate, the easiest way to spread the news. So drop the comments, drop the thumbs up, share wherever people get information and wherever you like to share. Thank you for being here. A special shout out to those who are jumping into the stream today. DJ, Millie, Jazz, Jazzy, welcome. Sandy, Mindy, thank you for being here. Thank you, everyone, for being the best part of what we do here at On the Pen. Lots to get into. A lot has transpired in the last week, not only for On the Pen and me personally, but in the world of obesity medicine. It just seems like it moves faster and faster every week, and it is so difficult to keep up, yet so invigorating, because I believe that the future is really bright when it comes to both the development of new medications to treat the disease of obesity, as well as this whole conversation of access and accessibility to these medications. We talk a lot about on this channel how, you know, we can have the best drugs in the world, we can have the best data in the world, we can have the best molecules out there and the best treatments out there, but it means nothing if people cannot get them. And so I'm feeling invigorated by some of the stuff that's happening in the news, both this past week and just kind of looking at zooming out at the broader picture. There's, of course, some troubling things that we're going to highlight as well. So thank you for being here. And we are going to jump right into it. So this past week on Substack, which is where we are literally dropping articles throughout the week and even on the weekend, 90% of what we drop over on Substack is completely free. And a lot of people get concerned about, new platform, I don't want to learn it. It's not that. That can actually be very confusing to people because I think one of the things that people think when they hear Substack is I'm going to have to learn a new platform, and I don't want to do that. It's actually just as simple as a newsletter. It's where our newsletter comes out. And because we do breaking news, there's always news coming. So even a couple articles a day, sometimes we get. And the beauty of Substack is you can go to onthepen.substack.com and just punch your email in there completely free. You're going to get that news delivered to your inbox. In other words, if you're watching on YouTube, if you're watching on X or LinkedIn or wherever you get On the Pen, we are beholden to what the algorithm decides to show us. But when you sign up at Substack, it just simply puts the information in your inbox. If the headline looks like it's interesting to you, you click it. If it doesn't, you don't, but you know you're seeing it. And one of the big complaints that I get a lot of times on all of these platforms is that we just don't see your content in our feed. And so it sort of decouples us from that challenge of getting the information to you and not being beholden to whatever social media platform algorithm is sort of gatekeeping the information that we have. If you want to contribute to what we're doing at On the Pen, we also made an announcement this past week that we will be moving into, that's right, we will be moving into a newsroom. We have procured a building. We've got a newsroom coming. This is a massive update in the On the Pen world. So we are continuing to push forward with your support, building the first obesity medicine news platform from the patient perspective. So if you do the paid version, it's $12.99 a month, a little bit cheaper if you pay a year in advance. You're going to get all of our information, including that 10% that we mark off, that is really just the deeper dives, the deeper sort of, a lot of times it's speculation based upon things that I know that are going on in the industry. It's just sort of the deeper dives in my head rather than just other headlines that you could get everywhere else. So I hope that you'll continue to join us, continue to help us build this. This is really special what we're doing it On the Pen, and we're doing it together. So we announced that this past week. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who has jumped in on the Substack. That's the best way that you can support what we're doing right now, is just jump over to Substack, jump into that paid subscription, and that's going to help us continue to grow. So big news. We also hit #1 on Substack this week in health and wellness. That was an amazing feat for On the Pen. When you talk about just reaching new audiences, there are so many people, friends, who need help. There are so many people out there who still think obesity is their fault. They think they're moral failures, and they think there is no hope. They've tried everything there is to try. And these medications, we're setting the record straight on them at On the Pen every single day with every single news article. We're pushing for advocacy so that people can access these medications more efficiently. And so all of these things sort of play into what we're doing here at On the Pen, and we're doing it together. So we hit #1 on Substack. That was a big goal because this old gray beard turns 40 in just a couple weeks. On June 7th, I turned 40, and we really want to push the podcast to the top 10 of medical news podcasts. We've been right there over the past couple weeks, got as high as 13. But you going to the podcast, giving it a 5-star rating and review, and just downloading the week's podcast really helps to push that. So we hit #1 on Substack, hit the goal there really easily. Cracking into that top 10 of the podcast, we're up against some really, really big names. So we need to move together to make that happen. So that's just a couple of the more exciting things that happened in the world of On the Pen, the newsroom that we'll be moving into, the hitting the #1 on Substack as well. But a lot happened since the last week's podcast. And so I want to jump into what happened since then. And a couple of these stories kind of touch on each other. So we actually got a rundown from the judge's decision in the compound Tirzepatide case. So if you didn't get a chance to view this, this is available over on our Substack. But the judge in Texas, Judge Pittman, unsealed the ruling against the OFA in their case against the FDA over the Tirzepatide shortage status. That decision really closing the chapter on the mass compounding of copies of Tirzepatide, right? So you have two different basically buckets of compounds. You have the 503Bs, which are basically just pound for pound copies in both the active pharmaceutical ingredient and the doses it's available in. You can't mass compound those unless it's in shortage. Otherwise, you have to abide by the patent laws that deal with these molecules. That is over. The shortages are officially over per the FDA, and then doubled down by this ruling in this court. And so really an interesting, we saw this shaping up this way over the last 6 months as we covered this like no one else has covered in the world. Basically, we have seen this judge kind of moving this direction. But interestingly, when they had their in-person hearing a couple weeks ago, when I was down in DC, we had heard that based upon that hearing, the judge was really starting to question the information that Lilly was providing to the FDA and the fact that the FDA was sort of just blindly accepting it. And so it really felt like the judge was seriously calling into question the data. But then with the actual opinion released, went 180 degrees the opposite direction. Basically, in the ruling, Judge Pittman said that the FDA followed the law in how it removed the drugs from the shortage list. He found that the FDA didn't need to go through a public notice and comment process. They were allowed to just handle it internally. And the agency did end up using up-to-date data, even though it included forecasts that was in it within it, that they were within their rights to look at national numbers and not local shortages. The FDA wasn't required to count compounded tirzepatide demand when looking at past shortages. Very interesting. And even though the FDA relied heavily on data from Eli Lilly, the court ruled that it was reasonable since Lilly was the only one who had the full data on supply and demand. So this was interesting ruling, because he sort of went back the other way and ruled against compounding. Now, sort of in contrast with this story, because once the 503Bs go away, at least in compound tirzepatide, semaglutide's right around the corner too, you start to see these telehealth companies do a strong shift to custom doses. We've seen a lot about microdosing in the last week. There's an article just today about Noom now offering microdosing of compounded copies of Wegovy. So custom doses, custom formulations, that's what is allowed under 503A regulations, regardless of shortage. So in other words, if the patient has a need that precipitates, a custom dose or a custom formulation that isn't available through the branded versions, 503As can sort of fill that role. So you've seen a strong and seismic shift within the telehealth industry to these custom doses and custom formulations. Now, to stop those, Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk would have to basically coerce the government into enacting legislation that took action against 503As and actually sort of changed the laws, because 503As as they exist today have existed for 100 years. The 503A pharmacies have always been able to do custom doses, custom formulations. That was sort of codified in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act when they developed 503Bs as well. But 503As are, in the truest sense, how pharmacies have always been. And so it would require an act of legislation to change that, or this sort of exclusive news article that we posted on our Substack the other day, where we learned that doctors are actually being threatened with a financial blackout over compounded medication. So a doctor speaking on condition of anonymity with On the Pen over the weekend sent us a letter that should send a chill down the spine of every patient and provider in this country, because it didn't come from the FDA. It didn't come from a state medical board. It came from the company that manages their electronic medical records. So an EMR is the acronym, but most of you know it as Epic. There are a couple other ones, but if you go to the doctor and you log on afterwards to your chart and you see the information about the visit, that's an EMR. Right. And this letter to this prescriber came from the EMR saying basically, hey, the merchant services side that we provide through our EMR is essentially saying that you need to verify that you're not prescribing compounds, because if you are, they're going to take away your ability to do merchant services. Now, this has been, a story that has kind of bubbled up in the recesses of the internet and conversations and forums, etc. But this has not been something that's been widely reported on. Stripe is the back end of this EMR in terms of the payment processing, and Stripe to sort of be a difficult player when it comes to this stuff. But the EMR that sent the letters, we ended up getting multiple reports over the last couple of days from other doctors that received the same letter. This EMR's name is Tebra, and Tebra, like I said, uses Stripe on the back end. Now, we've had really good industry contacts running this down with Stripe, and they're not getting a lot of straight answers. So we don't know for sure whether this was Tebra, the EMR, using Stripe as kind of a, scapegoat or what. But what we do know is that having electronic medical records providers putting doctors on notice that they can't be prescribing compounds or they'll lose access to not only their payment processing, but their EMR is a groundbreaking move. Because when you are a medical provider, if you lose your merchant services provider, in other words, the company that processes payments from your patients, you can find another processor that can handle those payments. But if you have your electronic medical records company threatening to take away your electronic medical records and your lifeline sort of to your patients, that is the type of sort of intervention that would definitely cause a prescriber to second guess prescribing what that prescriber thinks is medically necessary for a patient. So this is massive news to have an EMR basically threatening what amounts to threatening a doctor with their practice, because that is such a seismic change, especially for small practices, which seems to be small, mid-sized practices who this is targeting. That is a seismic change for them, and one that definitely would cause most, I would think, to have to pull back in their prescribing of compounded medications. So this is huge news. You heard it first from On the Pen on our Substack, another plug to go over there. But if this continues to happen, one of the things that I see potentially happening here is that these doctors would end up moving towards a cash pay model where they sort of take care of patients using compounded medications separately. Just imagine how this plays out. We've sort of seen it in the cannabis industry already. You see that essentially credit card companies and payment processors, they don't want to take payments for cannabis related items because cannabis has federal regulations where at the state level, in different states, it may be totally and perfectly legal, but because of the federal guidelines, a lot of the credit card companies don't want to touch payments. The banks don't want to touch payments because they don't want to run afoul of the federal government and lose their insurance backing or whatever it may be. So you see this cannabis market is largely a cash pay market, and where it's not a cash pay market is because vendors have essentially found ways around it and maybe called things something that they're not to allow the payment processes to exist. But if this happens to GLP-1s, compounds, specifically the 503As, this would be a way for sort of industry powers that be to leverage power over doctors to at least make this more challenging for patients and be a barrier to access. So this is something we're going to be watching very closely, and a story that I think is massive. It's massive, and you heard it here from On the Pen. So if you're a supporter of On the Pen, this is the kind of thing that you're supporting. As we get this news out, we're covering things that the mainstream media is not covering at all. Maybe they will in the future, but hey, let's be that beacon call to get this kind of stuff on the radar of the mainstream media so that we can call this stuff out and be out ahead of it. And you are a part of it with every like, with every subscription, with every share. All of those things are so integral to perpetuating what we're trying to do here at On the Pen. Now, the next story that I want to jump into today is a story of the most favored nation. So this was a big topic of conversation last week, essentially to sort of recap what the most favored nations is a policy, an executive order now that was signed by President Trump that is designed in simple terms to cap American drug prices at the lowest price paid in any major developed country. So you take all the major developed countries, similar economies, you take what the lowest price that any of those countries are paying, and it essentially says the United States and citizens herein shouldn't pay any more than that amount of money. And so the Trump administration has been trying to do this through executive action. Now, again, I have to say all this with the caveat because people get so crazy when I start talking about this, is I don't bring this up as somebody who is a partisan figure. I bring this up as somebody who is an advocate. So this isn't about partisan politics. It's about advocacy. And one of the things that I was bullish on with the Trump administration was what they tried to do at the end of their first administration with the most favored nation status, because this is actually something that with the proper teeth and enforcement behind it could actually bring prices down on prescription drugs in a way that no other administration in our lifetime has been able to accomplish. Now, if you doubt me, if you doubt that, this now has bipartisan support. So this was a big story this past week, is that not only did Trump sign the executive order, which again would have leveraged the power of the federal government to basically put their thumbs on the scale with pharmaceutical companies. In other words, to make their life very difficult if they didn't just comply with most favored nation status. But obviously the better result would be for new law to be enacted and signed by Congress, enacted by Congress and signed into law by President Trump, because executive actions lack it's not creating a new law from the executive branch. That's not what it is. It's acting within the confines of existing law to make it happen. What's different with most favored nations this time than it was last time is actually the last Democratic administration, President Biden enacted the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was signed into law and codified. And within that is a mechanism for the government to negotiate drug prices through Medicare. And so now that there is that existing framework, the Trump administration can sort of work within that law to carry out their policy. And so while the executive orders do not create law, they basically direct the federal government and how to carry out that law. Before the IRA, which was, again, the handiwork of the last administration and the last Congress and Senate, that framework is now there to implement something like this in a meaningful way. And so what we saw this past week was not only that the executive order was signed, which we covered last week on the podcast, but we saw Democrats actually move to codify through law Trump's drug pricing order. So this past week, President Trump signed the executive order that, again, sort of is a jumping off point for this whole idea. But what we saw was that very shortly after, within days, Representative Ro Khanna, a Democratic representative from the state of California, proposed legislation that would take the executive order pretty much word for word, I believe, and have it pass through Congress and create this into a law. I believe that this was also backed by Senator Bernie Sanders. So we have a very, very, very bipartisan approach where we see an executive order come from the Republican president, and then you see Democratic representatives moving to codify this. So we'll see if this happens. This definitely has the framework to bring down prices of prescription drugs in a way that we have not seen in our country before. This is something that I believe personally, if it can be, especially if it can be codified and brought into law, would be a great way to, again, this isn't demanding. A lot of people just think this is a price control. This is the U.S. saying we're not going to pay more than this. But actually, if you read through the executive order, what this is a partnership between the United States government and the pharmaceutical industry to help coerce other nations to actually bring the prices of their medications up and spread out the cost of prescription drugs around the developed world, rather than the United States always footing the bill for all the innovation. We learned that the United States is responsible for 2/3 of the profits of pharmaceutical companies, yet we are 4% of the population in the world. And we can simply no longer to afford, as the rest of the world grows wealthier, as their economies grow stronger, we can no longer subsidize those systems that allow their citizens to pay so much less than we pay in the United States. So in my humble opinion, it's a great policy. We'll see what happens. Baked within this executive order is also this direct-to-consumer idea, which plays off of Lilly Direct and Novo Care, which allow patients to go directly to the manufacturer at a cash pay price. So this creates a system where the federal government works with the pharmaceutical companies to basically skirt around the PBMs. So we also have, while it's not legislation that abolishes PBMs, it simply creates a system and framework and has the government, sort of the full force of the federal government behind it, to create a direct-to-consumer market for prescription drugs. Now, we have covered in all the nuances, the things that we like about it, the things that we don't like about it. This isn't a deep dive into that. If you want that, go over to the Substack and read all the articles we posted this past week, because there are concerns that I have about independent pharmacies, for example. How do independent pharmacies survive in a world where NovoCare and Lilly Direct largely cut out the pharmacies altogether? In terms of Lilly Direct, you're going through their mail order pharmacies, you're going through their selected vendors. What happens to your independent pharmacy on the street corner, right? In that process, if everybody's going direct to a drug manufacturer. So we don't want to see the cost of these drugs stay the same and just who profits off of them shift, right? We don't want to see the PBMs get cut out of the picture, but then pharma just makes all the money. We want to see most favored nations pricing, and we want to see the rest of the world paying similar to what we're paying. That will bring the cost of these drugs up in those other developed nations and bring the cost here down and just sort of level the playing field instead of having these massive discrepancies. Now, one of the interesting things that we saw this past week was also we heard from I believe his name is Lucas Montarce. He is the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer of Eli Lilly, and he actually spoke this past week at a investors conference, and it was a very interesting take that he had. He basically called the most favored nations executive order a stick to sort of poke and prod at big pharma to bring the prices of their medications down. And so it's kind of like a flippant response. So it seems like the pharmaceutical industry, if you're just judging off of that comment alone, isn't maybe taking this all that seriously. That is why I think we need to be behind codifying this into law and really getting serious about that. So we'll see how all this shakes out. You know, I don't pretend to know. I don't pretend to know. I don't pretend to do anything. What I do is that I do advocate for greater accessibility to GLP-1 medications and treatment for people who are sick and diseased. And I know that the current system and the current environment leaves way too many people on the margins, and it needs to be fixed. And this is the first meaningful thing that I've seen in a long, long time that could actually make a dent in that. So I want to thank our sponsor. Never want to waste an opportunity to thank the people who bring this podcast to us each and every week and allow us to put our heart and soul into this. Our partners at Roe, they have a program called the Roe Body Program where patients lose 15 to 20% of their body weight in a year when coupling these new therapies for treating obesity with lifestyle modifications and interventions. Of course, if you're going to start a new medication, you need to familiarize yourself with some of the side effects that can come with that. You can do all of that at roe.co/OTP is kind of the gateway to all the information about the Roe Body Program, including information about these medications that are prescribed when medically appropriate. Thank you to Roe for being such a great partner with On the Pen, and thank you all for being the best part of what we do here. Please jump over to the Substack. Give it a subscribe today. Can't encourage you enough to jump over there. Again, it's a simple email list that just allows you to get your news that matters to you directly to your inbox. So if that's important to you, please jump over and help us maintain this momentum that we have going. Again, we hit number 1 on Substack this week in health and wellness, and you can help us stay there by simply dropping your email in there, signing up for those email alerts. For those of you who are paid subscribers at $12.99 a month, it is the best way to support what we do. And within the coming weeks, like I said at the top of the podcast, we will be opening up our first official news studio for On the Pen. It is going to be I can't even believe what's happening, but we could not do it without you. This is a movement that we are doing together. I couldn't do it without the Donnas of the world, without the Karens of the world, Chasing Sunshine. I see you. Neo Queen. I could not do it without support like the support that Michael Clanton gives us or Jay May gives us. Thank you. Sue the Dude as well. Some of these stalwart supporters of what we're doing. And this is becoming something big. Can you all even believe it? Some of you who are in the comments of the live video today, can you even believe how far we've come in just a couple years? This is building. We're doing it together, and I can't do it without you. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being the best part of what we do here at On the Pen. I look forward to this each and every week. I can't wait to do it again. But until next week, have a great week. Take care, friends.